Hey guys, have you ever seen that sign that goes above the sink sometimes that says, "In the infinite moments it takes to read this, I did my dishes"? Is that a passive aggressive sign? It's kind of true. I know that treating washing the dishes as a meditative practice um, is really nice. It calms me down, I know, but it's also kind of like a weird note. Any note like that always can kind of rub people the wrong way if they feel it's directed directly at them personally. That's kind of the problem of the person who feels like it's an insult or a dig directed at them. I mean, the dishes do have to get done. That's just a reality. When I was younger, and by younger I mean 22 years old, I had a really hard time doing the dishes in any capacity. My mom had kind of like done everything for me up to that point. Laundry, dishes. She made my lunch up until I was about 17, like my lunch to take to school. And I didn't really have a concept of the labor required for just basic existence. So it was kind of a slow revelation to me that I had to actually clean up after myself, especially when sharing spaces and workloads with other people. And I think the real kind of revelation was when my friend and I were illegally camping by a river in the Yukon, and I just wasn't really washing dishes. And my friend at some point just said, "You know, you're gonna have to start washing the dishes." And that was a moment. I was like, "Oh, I'm gonna have to start washing the dishes because I make dishes dirty. And by not washing the dishes, I'm making my friend, who I care about, clean up after me." I had to sit with that for a while. I'm not sure if I actually even improved my dishwashing contributions immediately. It was still a challenge. It was definitely a trial to kind of really embrace what that means to pull my own weight and be a contributing member of society. But more importantly than that, be somebody who understands that we all have to equally carry the responsibility for each other, not just ourselves, that by making somebody else clean up after me without doing anything in return for that either was really not cool and not something that aligned with who I believed I was. But there it was, confronting me in my face. It's not who I thought I was. So it felt like an insult. But I eventually learned. It took some work. It took a lot of work. And yeah, that's, still in these times, it's mid-June, early June of 2020. Still having to remind myself and other people all the time that being called a racist or told that something you do is racist is not actually an insult. It's information that is there to help you understand the beliefs and attitudes and actions you have that perpetuate racism throughout our society. And that's something that's hard to accept. I mean, I'm able to say this to people, but even now, it's that immediate feeling of becoming defensive or getting my back up is still exists. And the problem with those feelings of defensiveness is that it's hard to take information in and to understand how to move forward if your immediate reactions are that somebody thinks I'm bad. And that's, again, not really what it's about. I mean, the person might think you're bad, but that's not that doesn't really matter what they think about you as a human being. What's more important is understanding how the beliefs in the belief system you have contributes to white supremacy. Even if you're not white, that's a big one too. Or even if you don't believe that you're white, but you still benefit from the systems and structures that we know as white supremacy today. And for quite a while, going back into the past too. I mean, right now, I read a really nice quote today that a friend sent out along with an open letter she had written upon her resignation from a really cushy position in a well-funded and established museum as a result of the institutional racism and ableism and sexism that she perceived around her. And the quote, I can't remember it exactly, but basically the takeaway, the really useful takeaway is like, the thing about this moment now is to, if we want to actually see change, is to take it and run with it and make sure that things happen. It's a hard balance because you also don't want to burn out, and it's not about just waiting, and it's also not about like going 100%. It's kind of about listening a lot. Listening a lot is good. And if you need to make a statement or take a stand, that's really important. I think conversations people have one-on-one with friends and family, and also just with themselves, with myself, reading materials provided to me from people I trust, or that I've sought out on my own, that challenge my own perceptions or perhaps feel a little scary to read. That's challenging, but that's a huge part of the work people have to do. It's not just about going out in public and saying things you feel you have to say. That's probably actually not a great start. I mean, but I don't know. I'm talking about Twitter. Twitter's a really hard place. I don't know what Facebook's like, but everybody is stressed out over Twitter, and it sometimes seems like the big public conversations, especially over sort of like really problematic issues, are often taken over by people who are operating out of a sense of defensiveness. But then there's people who are able to respond to things they see that are problematic, that come from people they know, and reaching out to them one-on-one to discuss the issues and why they might be problems. That's really impressive and probably a lot more likely to affect longer-lasting positive change. Like, what we all want is to move forward towards defunding and perhaps abolishing the police. That's really important. And today in my city, Toronto, it was announced that the family of a young woman who was murdered a couple years ago in Toronto, and the police basically were like, well, she's a drunk slut, so we don't need to look for her. And so her mother ended up driving, I think, 4 hours to get to Toronto and looked for her herself and found her dead, naked body in an alleyway that was basically like, it was, I think like 10 meters from where the cops said that they had been searching for her. And this is a young white woman who died. And she's not the first young white woman in this city to be murdered and have zero follow-up from the Toronto Police Service. And you see the same thing in the gay community with the Bruce MacArthur serial killings in the gay village. And this started out with men of color disappearing. After some white men, what was his name? It seems like a very lovely man, Andrew something. He also disappeared, and he was maybe the fifth or sixth person to disappear. And the police finally came out into the community and said there's no serial killer. I'm just saying all these things to kind of point out that, like, anti-Black racism in the police force, if we can't end that and eradicate that racism, we're going to continue to experience deep misogyny within the police force, deep homophobia, transphobia, racism that touches all marginalized people. Yeah, it's pretty, fuck the police. I've had a number of interactions with the police over my lifetime, as most people do to greater and lesser degrees. And I would say that when dealing with the police over anything that has to do with domestic or sexual violence, in Toronto, they're absolutely useless. The spectrum is from useless to belittling. That's kind of the range you get with the police here. In dealing with like really weird shit, I had somebody try and set fire to a house I was house sitting in, and it was a very bizarre circumstance how that like a sculpture was built inside the building and set fire to. The police were fine. I mean, that's a property damage crime, so they were fine, but also useless. There was no follow-up. It was just kind of like they came and did a performance and left. And in protest situations, they're just terrible. They're horrific. As we can see, from what's happening in the United States, we're not immune to that here. I'm sure, pretty much anywhere. It's that weird power trip that people get off on. And the other strange part is I was once in a kettle, and it was a really bad situation. We were there for hours in a thunderstorm. And the riot police all around us, I mean, this is Toronto. I'm very proud of our diversity. And the riot police were people of color, women, younger officers, and you could see the look on their faces. They were not happy to be there. And not just because it was raining. Like, it was, I don't know, fear, shame. Some of them loved it, of course, but like, it was not for the most part, these people were not super proud to be there, but they did it anyway. Nobody walked away. They knew what they were doing was, like, in all likelihood, illegal. Warrantless detention of innocent civilians. But then when they started letting us out in ones and twos, and as you left, there were these sort of like fat old white guys with mustaches, gray mustaches, standing under an awning out of the rain with hot coffees, laughing at us, laughing at everybody who is being let out of this really terrible situation. So, I don't know. Whatever. I'm still angry about that. The guy who was responsible for that, who was the chief of police at that time, he's like Minister of Public Safety or something now. All these cops are on the board of directors of all the weed companies. Like, they can do whatever the fuck they want. Criminals. They're all criminals and pigs. But today, it was very sad. I had to put into the compost this little weedling I was growing. I have two my friend gave me, and in Canada, it's totally normal. And so even kind of like very square, straight people like me grow a little weed clones as like a science experiment and as a fun decorative plant and as gardening, because why not? So we had two, and one of them, they're in the water for about a week, and I'm not seeing any roots, and I don't believe these things are gonna root. I'm like, there's no way this is gonna root. But one of them really starts to root and is like doubling the size of the roots every day. And my friend is like, well, you should put it in soil. I have another one that's even better condition, but the roots are just these little hundreds of white nubs up and down the stem. But this one that really took off, I send her a picture and she's like, oh, that looks like a male. And I'm like, really? She's like, yeah. I'm like, shit, should I separate them? Because I sent her a picture of the other one and she was like, that's gorgeous. That's a gorgeous female. And I was like, thank you. Thank you, I know. But now the question was to separate them. And she's like, well, why don't you just grow it? And I was like, well, I'd have to take it outside. And she's like, oh, yeah, maybe not, because it'll ruin your neighbor's harvest. And I'm like, I can't see any weed plants from my deck. And she's like, think of it this way. Imagine your plant is fucking all the neighborhood plants without a condom and getting them pregnant with 50,000 babies. And I was like, oh, that sounds terrible. There's no consent in that situation, and I'm the rapist. So I composted the plant, which is fine. I'm starting to feel okay about it. I'm starting to feel not so bad about composting it because the other one is looking good. And what will I do when it's big enough? I guess I'm going to put it on my deck, but the raccoons will probably come and destroy it. Not because they like to get high, but because they like to destroy things. I don't know. The raccoons are present in my life. They're just present in my life. And I can't ignore that. They still come to whenever there's new babies in the neighborhood, they come to the door to my deck, which is in my bedroom, and they start cooing at me. Whatever weird noises they make and scratching at the door. They want to come in and cuddle. It's so fucked up. But yet at the same time, others will come over and just be like, shoo, and they go away. And that's just not fair. Because I don't actually want to be these raccoons' friend. But that's just what happens. Things for me really aren't bad. I'm not an essential worker. And I get to worry about things like the male clone that I have to compost. I had planted it too. I planted it first, and then my friend's like, uh-oh. I needed to compost it. I couldn't be like a rapist of botany, or a rapist of weed, a rapist of weed, as opposed to a weed rapist, which is something different. I think so. Language, it matters. Language matters. Yeah. Well, at least there's a breeze. There's changes everywhere. In Northern Ontario this week, there will be blizzards. But where I live in Toronto, it is very hot. The temperatures are anticipated to be close to 40, which I knew would happen. This summer's just going to be gross. We're going to have a lot of hot weather, and hotter than I think we've ever been used to. And that's just a reality. Changes are everywhere, and we can't have... If we don't have... I mean, it's a just transition everyone talks about, and it's true. It's just like dealing with the police. If there's no justice for everybody, then there's no justice for anybody. And we can tell ourselves that, but there will always be room to hurt people if we just tacitly agree that some people are allowed to be hurt. My mother volunteered me for something this week. We had a great conversation. I was really proud of her about race and anti-Black attitudes that we hold without examining. And I was really impressed with her, just her own thinking about this. And I think it was quite humble and completely no defensiveness, you know? And that was great. And we talked about some interesting stuff. I mean, she's even... within the community, she's kind of in a good position for this. She's even considering joining the local community policing committee in an effort to help defund the police and put more money towards community programs for youth, which I think she'd be a great voice in that. But shortly after that conversation, I get this email from her where she's written to her faith community that sent out a really good solidarity statement that included about 7 very specific actionable items that they as a synagogue were going to be implementing, and it was great. It was really impressive, the kind of thought that went into it, but also not surprising. This is a very this is a very justice oriented place. And so my mom writes to them and CCs me. She goes, "Oh, me and my daughter were just talking about this. What can we do to help?" And immediately I know that I'm now in a really uncomfortable position, because yes, I want to be working on these issues like everybody should be, but I don't want to volunteer to do them with my mother at her synagogue. And more than that, on kind of this other level that was really, really disturbing to me, is just this thing of, she didn't ask me before volunteering. There was no conversation. There was nothing, no discussion about, hey, I'd like to do this. Do you want to do this with me? It was just this unilateral, like, yeah, me and my daughter are going to do this. And I just don't like it. There's consent. I thought about it. I'm like, well, does she think I think she treats me like her partner sometimes. But even if I was her partner, I would want to be asked before being volunteered. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe she's also treating me like a little child. But I think even little children should be asked, like, do you want to do this thing, before you sign them up for it. I just don't think that, like, and even if they, I mean, you know, your little child or your partner says no, if you still want to be an asshole and sign them up anyway, at least they know that you are going to do something that they have no interest in, and you have a heads up. You're gonna have to, like, turn somebody down at some point. But I now have to figure out an email that is both respectful of my mother, respectful of the racial justice initiatives of the synagogue, and respectful of my boundaries, that I have my own communities I work in and am committed to. Not that we shouldn't be doing this in every aspect of our lives. I'm just not looking to put more energy into a faith community right now. But I don't need to write that email right away. I will probably write it tomorrow, because I don't usually sit on things too long, for better or for worse. I think it's, I admire people who are able to sit on things for a while. I'm learning. There's some things I've sat on for weeks, because I'm like, I don't actually have to respond to this. And that's usually in situations where it's somebody who I am confronting with the problematic and prejudicial actions or systems that they have in place, and they are coming back at me telling me I'm the problem. And that you don't actually have to respond at all. I learned I'm the kind of person, I always felt like I'm obligated to respond, and no, 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 no. If they're the ones with the inappropriate behavior, actually, I can take my time and or never respond, which is something I would always tell to other people, but I'd never really applied to myself. And just apply that wisdom to yourself. That's a good thing sometimes. Be your own best friend. Isn't that the advice they tell you? What would you say to your best friend if they were saying these things to you about themselves? That's golden advice. Just like in the infinite moments it takes to read this, I did my dishes.